The White House has been hosting the cast of sporting comedy show Ted Lasso.
While it's easier said than done, we also have to know that we shouldn't be afraid to ask for help ourselves. And that does take
President Biden invited Jason Sudeikis to discuss mental health. It's a subject the show has addressed directly. In the most recent season, the lead character seeks therapy to address anxiety and the collapse of his marriage. Before the meeting, President Biden tweeted a picture of a Believe sign taped to the entrance of the Oval Office, a homage to Ted's office door in the TV series. You're watching BBC News. I'm on Twitter at AnitaBBC.
This is BBC News. Welcome if you're watching here in the UK or around the globe. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. Our top stories. President Putin says the Chinese leader Xi Jinping has invited him to Beijing as the two men hold talks in Moscow aimed at boosting ties.
Recent events have accelerated Russia's dependency on China. Putin and Xi may speak about mutually beneficial cooperation, but Beijing looks increasingly like the senior partner.
Britain's biggest police force is branded institutionally racist, misogynist and homophobic in a scathing new report which says it needs a complete overhaul to restore public faith.
The culture, sadly, in the Met is all pervasive, and that the institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia is largely led by what their officers have said and what our own research has shown.
I understand the label institutional is something that is used by some people. I don't use that label myself, not because I'm trying to demur from the findings and the detail in the report, simply because it means different things to different people. It's ambiguous.
Barricades go up in New York in preparation for protests. A grand jury could make history by indicting former President Donald Trump over alleged hush money paid to a porn actress. European stock markets recover in early trading, with shares in banks rallying after moves to reassure investors following the takeover of Credit Suisse. Hello and welcome. The Chinese President Xi Jinping, who's in Moscow, has described Russia and China as strategic partners and great neighbouring powers. On the second day of his visit, Mr. Xi invited President Putin to visit Beijing this year and said he would make ties with Moscow a priority. On Friday, the International Criminal Court accused President Putin of war crimes and issued an arrest warrant. China does not recognise the court. From Moscow, our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg reports. Jeremy Page, Asia diplomatic editor for The Economist, thank you very much indeed. Here in the UK, a scathing review of Britain's largest police force, London's Metropolitan Police, has found it to be institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. The report's author, Baroness Casey, said many Londoners had lost faith in the Met Police and the force could be broken up if it didn't change. Our special correspondent Lucy Manning has more. Sadiq Khan there. Well, I'm joined now by Ruth Davison, the Chief Executive of Refuge, a UK charity providing support for women experiencing domestic violence. Thanks for joining us. Ruth Davison, when you see this report looking at discrimination against people from so many different groups, what's your reaction? Ruth Davison, Chief Executive of Refuge, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
To the United States now, where Donald Trump could be about to make history by becoming the first former president to be placed under arrest. There's growing speculation that he could be indicted on charges stemming from an investigation into a hush money payment to a porn star, Stormy Daniels, in 2016, made prior to the presidential election. Steel barricades have been put up outside the Manhattan Criminal Court, where Mr. Trump could be charged, fingerprinted and photographed if charges are filed. Now, Asian and European stock markets have recovered further at the start of trading today, with shares in banks rallying. Stocks climbed on Monday in London and New York after central bankers and politicians moved to reassure investors following the takeover of Credit Suisse at the weekend. Well, I'm joined now by Tobias Straumann, Professor of Economic History at Zurich University. Thanks for joining us. Do you think we are seeing the move by governments to reassure everyone in the financial world? Is that succeeding, or are we not through this yet? OK, we will have to leave it there. Tobias Straumann, thank you very much indeed there from Zurich University. Well, I'm on Twitter at Geeta Guru-Murthy, and we are back with much more, including much more, of course, on our breaking news, that continued meeting that we're seeing between the Chinese and Russian leaderships, with the Japanese Prime Minister arriving in Ukraine today. So East Asian leaders being very much drawn into the conflict in Europe. This is BBC News. Thanks for being with us.
Hello there. Across much of Europe at the moment, temperatures are running a little bit above average.
Jessica and Austin, when murder goes viral.
Hard Talk
On BBC World
on
News.
BBC iPlayer.
I want to talk to you about the politics of this. Did she not think she was going to get that question?
It's important to remember that this is a negotiation.
It's a good photo of
I have an opportunity to create chaos.
There is always an email. We are so insignificant.
Now on BBC World News, your daily briefing on business and economics from the world's financial centres. From New Broadcasting House in London,
News
World Business
in depth.
Report.
The context.
Pollution problems. The Dutch government is in court defending its plans to cut flights at one of the world's busiest airports. Cash for Colombo. Sri Lanka gets a $3 billion international bailout, but will it be enough to end food and fuel shortages? We'll be live in the capital. Hello and welcome to World Business Report, whether you're watching in the UK or around the world. I'm Jonathan Josephs. The aviation industry is hugely important to the global economy, but it's also seen as one of the most polluting. It's responsible for about 2.5% of the carbon emissions that are warming the planet. That and noise pollution is why the Dutch government is trying to cut the number of flights at Amsterdam's Schiphol airport by more than 10%. And it's defending its plans in court today. But of course, airlines aren't happy. The likes of the local flag carrier KLM, America's Delta and EasyJet are behind the legal action that's being heard. They've invested heavily in what is the third busiest airport in the world for international passengers. Let's get more and speak to our correspondent Anna Holligan, who I'm pleased to say joins us from The Hague. Anna, this is quite an interesting case being watched around the world because lots of governments are in a similar situation. But just tell us, what are the arguments both sides are laying out in court today? So watch this space, 2 weeks' time for that verdict. Anna Holligan in The Hague for us. Thank you very much indeed. Now, China's top anti-graft watchdog has started an investigation into Zhao Weibo, the former chairman of the computer chip maker Tsingshan Uni Group. He's the latest high-profile business figure to now be ensnared in an industry-wide corruption dragnet. Our Asia business reporter Yao da Silva has more from Singapore. That was our Asia business reporter Yao da Silva. Now, for the last decade, forest-dwelling people in the eastern Indian state of Chittagong have been strenuously opposing a new coal mining project by the Adani Group, which is one of India's biggest conglomerates. Despite their resistance, final clearances to the project were granted last year, which have triggered ongoing protests which have lasted for more than a year now. Nikhil Indamar has sent us this report from the epicenter of those protests. Just time to have a quick look at the markets. If we think back to yesterday, Credit Suisse was the big story after that bailout deal being rescued by UBS, but bank stocks in Europe are slightly up today. Investors breathing a sigh of relief, all those reassurances from the policymakers and politicians that they have contained these problems in the financial system. That's all from World Business Report. There's plenty more on the website. Thanks very much for watching.
You're watching BBC News. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. I just want to let you know that Boris Johnson has had his evidence to the Privileges Committee published now, in which we gather he says that he does accept that he did mislead the House of Commons when he said lockdown rules had been followed in number 10, but insisted the statements were made in good faith. That report has just been published. We are looking through it and we'll bring you more on it in the coming minutes. We're just going to go back to the other big story here in the UK, that damning review into the UK's biggest police force that has been published this morning after a year-long investigation. Baroness Casey was appointed to investigate the culture at the Met Police Force following the rape and murder of Sarah Everard by serving officer Wayne Couzens. The 363-page report condemned the force as institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. The report said that staff routinely experience sexism, there are racist officers and staff and a deep-seated homophobia in the organisation. The report also accused the force of failing to protect the public from officers who abuse women, while predatory and unacceptable behaviour has been allowed to flourish. And it says the Met has a culture of denial with systemic and fundamental problems in how the force is run, adding the Met could be dismantled if it doesn't improve. Baroness Casey is the report author. She's been speaking to BBC Radio 4's Today programme. Smart really there. Let's speak to our reporter Yatunde Yusuf, who's been getting reaction to the report in Brixton Market. Yatunde, what are you finding? What are people saying there? OK, Yatunde, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just to bring you our breaking news this hour, Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, of course, has had his defence published before the committee hearing tomorrow on whether he misled the House of Commons about attending parties during the COVID lockdown. I'm joined from Westminster by our political correspondent, Jonathan Blake. This report is just dropping. I'm sure we're all just reading it. Jonathan, what's the initial assessment of what it says? And
BBC
Jonathan
World
Blake,
News.
we'll leave it there for now, but we'll come back to you in the coming hour, I'm sure. Thanks very much indeed. We're going to be hearing from Boris Johnson tomorrow as he appears before the Privileges Committee. It is an unprecedented move, really, within the British political system to see this. And we will see what the outcome is, whether the former Prime Minister eventually is found guilty of deliberately or recklessly misleading the House of Commons. Something that
any kind of
says
weather
in his evidence
problems
amounts
that you
to
can
him
imagine.
lying
We got them
to
here.
Parliament.
We have earthquakes.
Obviously, that
we
would
have
be considered a
tsunami.
very
Let's hope we have none of those things today, right?
Representing the British public, and we've seen the political heat around what happened with those gatherings during the COVID lockdown when everyone's movements were restricted. But there'll be a lot of focus on that in the
a lot of
days.
black people think they
We are back
cannot
with
go
that
to
much
the
more
water
at the
for
top of the
surfing,
hour.
and they can
But
do
now
it.
let's catch up.
Everybody can surf it. Everybody can do it. Everybody can surf.
Inspiring travel on the BBC.
This is BBC News. Welcome if you're watching here in the UK or around the globe. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. These are the latest headlines. Britain's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson accepts that he did mislead MPs about illegal parties held during COVID lockdowns, but insists his original denials were made in good faith. President Putin says the Chinese leader Xi Jinping has invited him to Beijing as the two men hold talks in Moscow aimed at boosting ties. Britain's biggest police force is branded institutionally racist, misogynist and homophobic in a scathing new report which says it needs a complete overhaul.
The culture, sadly, in the Met is all pervasive, and that the institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia is largely led by what their officers have said and what our own research has shown.
Today is, without doubt, one of the darkest days in the history of our almost 200-year-old Met Police Service.
The mother of the black teenager Stephen Lawrence, who was killed in a racist attack in London in 1993, says the force failed to act on similar assurances 24 years ago.
I understand the label institutional is something that is used by some people. I don't use that label myself, not because I'm trying to demur from the findings and the detail in the report, simply because it means different things to different people. It's ambiguous.
Sri Lanka's president says his country will no longer be deemed bankrupt as it prepares to receive the first instalment of a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. European stock markets recover in early trading, with shares in banks rallying after moves to reassure investors following the takeover of Credit Suisse. Hello, thanks for joining us. Evidence which Boris Johnson believes will prove he didn't knowingly mislead Parliament over Partygate allegations has just been published. In the dossier, Mr Johnson says he accepts that he misled the Commons when he said COVID rules had been followed in Downing Street, but he insists the statements were made in good faith. The former Prime Minister will be questioned, a televised hearing with a cross-party group of MPs about all this tomorrow afternoon UK time. Well, I'm joined now from Westminster by our political correspondent Jonathan Blake. Jonathan, we're just going through the evidence that's been published. Just give us a flavour of what Boris Johnson's argument is going to be. Jonathan Blake, thanks very much indeed. We'll let you have a few minutes to go and read the actual report in full and digest it properly. Thank you so much. Thank you. Now, the Chinese President Xi Jinping, who's in Moscow, has described Russia and China as strategic partners and great neighbouring powers. On the second day of his visit, Mr. Xi invited President Putin to visit Beijing this year and said he would make ties with Moscow a priority. Well, on Friday, the International Criminal Court accused President Putin of war crimes and issued an arrest warrant. Let's get more on this. I'm joined now by Jennifer Hugh, who is a research fellow at the Lowry Institute, an independent international policy think tank based in Sydney. Thanks for joining us. What do you read into what we've seen from the statements from both the Chinese and Russian leadership? Do you think there is real attempts here at any sort of peace plan, or are we going to see just increased support from China for Russia? I'm just looking at some pictures of President Xi arriving at the Kremlin today for the further summit. These pictures have come to us via the Russian news agencies. Of course, this is part of a 3-day state visit, and that is at the Kremlin. Xi Jinping arriving for that summit with Vladimir Putin. The delegations, of course, also there. And there was a long meeting between the two leaders on Monday. And this will continue. We don't know exactly what the outcome of the talks has been as yet. Let's move to the United States, where Donald Trump could be about to make history by becoming the first former president to be placed under arrest. There is growing speculation that he could be indicted on charges stemming from an investigation into a hush money payment to porn star Stormy Daniels in 2016, made prior to the presidential election. Well, steel barricades have been put out outside the Manhattan Criminal Court, where Mr. Trump could be charged, fingerprinted and photographed if charges are filed. Every member of the New York Police Department, including plainclothes detectives, has been ordered to wear their full uniform on Tuesday and is being placed on standby to mobilise as they prepare for potential unrest. Well, I'm joined by Scott Lucas, a professor of US politics at University College Dublin. Thanks for joining us. Can you explain for us what the legal position is here? What are we expecting? OK, Professor Scott Lucas, we will have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for your time today. We will be following those events in the US, of course, closely as well as they unfold. We've had some pictures also of President Putin and Xi starting their official ceremony, their official meeting at the Kremlin today at the start of the formal talks. That has been released by state television in Moscow. And of course, the two leaders had extensive talks on Monday at the start of this 3-day state visit. There's been a lot of focus on what's going on in Moscow as the world waits to see how much support the Chinese leadership will give to President Putin in this conflict that is proving so difficult around the world. We are back in a few minutes. This is BBC News.
Hello there. Generally, it's very mild across
a bit more sunshine out there
Europe.
today on what has been a pretty wet month so far, especially for...
It was the war that was never going to happen.
On BBC World News.
Я считаю, то, что происходит, военным преступлением. The invasion that shook the world.
As fighting continues in Ukraine, join our team for the latest developments.
I can't imagine that. In the fight back that took everyone by surprise.
See the headlines as they happen with breaking news alerts in the app and get a full story with bbc.com/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.
Watch on BBC iPlayer.
This is BBC News. Welcome if you're watching here in the UK or around the globe. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. These are the headlines. Britain's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson accepts that he did mislead MPs about illegal parties held during COVID lockdowns, but insists his original denials were made in good faith. President Putin says the Chinese leader Xi Jinping has invited him to Beijing as the two men hold talks in Moscow aimed at boosting their links. Barricades go up in New York in preparation for protests. A grand jury could make history by indicting former President Donald Trump over alleged hush money paid to a porn actress. Britain's biggest police force is branded institutionally racist, misogynist and homophobic in a scathing new report which says it needs a complete overhaul. Sri Lanka's president says his country will no longer be deemed bankrupt as it prepares to receive the first instalment of a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. Hello, thanks for joining us. We are bringing you news about the former Prime Minister here in the UK, Boris Johnson. Evidence that he believes will prove that he did not knowingly mislead Parliament over Partygate allegations. And those defence arguments have just been published. Here are some of the points that Johnson writes in his defence. He says that statements he made about rule breaking in Downing Street during the pandemic were made in good faith, on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time. He says, I did not intentionally or recklessly mislead the House on December the 1st, 2021, December the 8th, 2021, or any other date. Boris Johnson goes on to say that he relied on assurances that he received from his trusted advisers on what happened in Downing Street. He adds that any allegation that he was reckless to rely on the assurances he received from his advisers is unprecedented and absurd. Well, our political correspondent Rob Watson is with us. Rob, I don't know how much of this report you managed to read, but what's your sense of Boris Johnson's defence? Yeah, and I'm just looking at one of the paragraphs, having again just not fully read this myself either, but one of his advisors, Jack Doyle, has been reported in the press here in the UK a bit on paragraph 83. Boris Johnson talks about further support can be found in contemporaneous WhatsApp messages in the committee's possession. On the 10th of December, he says, I sent a message to Jack Doyle stating, is there a way we could get to the truth about this party out there? I trusted the assurances that Jack Doyle and others had given to me. We'll come back to you for more on that. We just want to go to the House of Commons for a statement by the Home Secretary, sorry to interrupt, Suella Braverman, on the Met Police report, which has just been published.
Are we about to? Are we all ready?
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement about Baroness Casey's review of the Metropolitan Police. I wish to put on record my thanks to Baroness Casey for undertaking this review on such a difficult and sensitive topic with the utmost professionalism.
Yvette Cooper, we're just going to come out of that statement, although I'm sure we'll pick up further with what the Shadow Home Secretary was saying a bit later. But we've kept Marcus Ryder waiting for a while. He's the editor of a collection of essays, Black British Lives Matter, and head of external consultancies at the Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity, an independent body working to achieve accurate representation of all sections of society across contemporary UK media at Birmingham City University. Thanks for joining us. We've had statements there in the House of Commons from the Home Secretary and the Shadow Home Secretary on this very damning report about the Met. First of all, on the report itself, what's your reaction? OK, Marcus Ryder, thank you very much indeed for joining us there. Thank you. Now, European banking shares are rallying today after days of turmoil on the stock market. Central bankers and politicians have moved to reassure investors following the takeover of Credit Suisse at the weekend. Tobias Stroman, Professor of Economic History at Zurich University, gave me his assessment of the state of the markets. Tobias Stroman, the Professor of Economic History at Zurich University, on the banking turmoil that we've seen. It's been a rather busy couple of hours, a busy news week, I think, at the moment. We are back, of course, in the coming moments, but that's it from me for now. I will see you tomorrow, and I'm on Twitter at Geeta Guru-Murthy. For now, bye-bye.
We empower those who act. Those who see the correlation between upswings and downswings. Those who manage risk by meeting each obstacle with a perfectly executed strategy, a measured approach, the right tools, driving accuracy. CME Group, where risk meets opportunity.
Hello. Yet another impactful winter storm is moving into California today, moving across California.
A year into Russia's invasion, Ukraine cast continues to keep you informed.
They'll just give one family that stays to look after the pets whilst our villagers get bombed.
With twice weekly updates.